Right, and we are live. Hello everyone, I'm Sourabhi Dutta Roy and I welcome you all to the Stories of Beliefs and Social Customs curated under TMYS Review June 2022 in collaboration with the Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submissions of essays, poems and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and project architecture, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. It's an absolute honor to be in the company of our esteemed panelists this evening, Professor Gerald James, Professor Paul Whitinui, and Professor Sourav Banerjee, who will shortly share their valuable views and insights with us. Our topic for today is establishing community identity through sports under the sub-theme Sports and Recreation. But before we move on to the discussion, I'd now like to take a brief moment to introduce each of our panelists. Professor Gerald R. James is past president of the North American Society for Sport History and past vice president of the International Society for the History of Physical Education and Sport. In 2012, the United States government selected him as a Fulbright Scholar. In 2016, he was awarded the Routledge Prize for Scholarship. He has authorized more than 250 publications, including 28 books. He is currently an editor for the Sport Identity and Culture series for Lexington Books. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, we have with us Professor Paul Whitinui, who is from the Confederation of Tribes in the far north of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is currently a full professor in the School of Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria, Canada. As an interdisciplinary social scientist, his research interests include issues related to the indigenous and Māori sport, physical activity and leisure, education, schooling, cultural safety, impact assessment, treaty and community-informed scholarship, health and well-being. We welcome you, sir. Uh, Professor Sourav Banerjee is an associate professor and head of the Department of English at the government-sponsored college under the University of Calcutta. He is an education ambassador of IOER Philippines, series editor of TMYS projects, a member of the International Advisory Board of the book series Post-Humanities and Citizenship Futures, an International Journal of Advanced Education and Technology, Indonesia. He has published papers and articles in many national and international journals and has also delivered many keynote speeches, plenary addresses, and invited lectures in India and abroad. He is the joint convener of ISPEL India and a member of IELTS India. We welcome you, sir. Right, we open the forum
Thank
for
you. Thank you
discussion.
very
We open the forum for discussion now. I would like to invite Professor Banerjee to take it over from here.
Okay. So thank you very much, and I'm actually elated to be in this panel of eminent panelists. But coming straight to the point, so the topic today is establishing community identity through sports. And at the very beginning, I'd like to make the point that I am no expert in sports, except that I have a deep interest. And so from that perspective, I'll try to relate to today's topic. So first and foremost, what I'll do is I'll begin with the definition of a community. So as we know, a community, we may say, is a social group whose members have something in common, such as a shared government, geographical location, and perhaps most importantly, a shared culture. Now, talking of culture, the English anthropologist Edward D. Tyler, he was the first to use the term culture in the modern sense, and had said that there are fundamentally three layers of culture depending upon our behavioral patterns. The first and foremost amongst them is the traditions that define our society. The second layer that generally becomes part of our identity is the subculture, and this is where I'll focus on my small talk today. And the third is what is called the cultural universals, which are rather the learned behavioral patterns that are shared by all human beings collectively all over the world. Now, again, to quote Raymond Williams, or rather to refer to Raymond Williams, he had pointed out that there are two kinds of cultures, and they are very different from each other. So one is a culture as an art, and the second is culture as a way of life. So he illustrates this difference by showing that the culture of the British working class movement is more of a matter of its political institutions like say the trade unions and the labor parties and the like, rather than its poetry or painting. Now, why am I talking of all these things here is because when we come to sports, it obviously is not merely an entertainment or a pastime. It is also a culture, maybe a very popular culture that defines a community or even a nation or a state. Obviously, I am getting a bit technical over here and have in mind Max Weber, Ernest Gellner, Eric Hobsbawm, and even Benedict Anderson when I'm thinking of the concepts of nation state and nation state. But I will not digress too much into these technicalities here now. But what I'll try to do is try to see how sports as an activity transcends being an entertainment and a pastime only to become an entity that defines community identity or becomes marker of a particular community identity. My focus today will be on an ancient South Indian sport, Jallikattu, or as it is popularly called, the bull taming show. Jallikattu is one of the ancient sports played as part of the Tamil harvest festival Pongal in major parts of the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. In ancient literature, this sport was also called Yeru Hazuvuthal or Manju Viratsu. This name Jallikattu comes from the word Jali meaning coin and Kattu meaning tie, as the game involved tying a bundle of coins to a bull's horn. This is also one of the oldest living sports in India, and the robust sport is a test of grit, with the bulls fiercely running past men while the bull tamers attempted to get onto their lumps to emerge victorious. Yeah, in the early days of this sport, women used to choose their husbands from among the brave who could tame these bulls. As part of the sport, as I already mentioned, the bull's horns were encrusted with gold, and those who caught the running bull took the straps and was declared the winners and was rewarded with both with those gold coins and the woman who chose to marry them. Uh, in the village of Tarik Kayar in the Nilgiri district, scenes of people chasing bulls are engraved on nearly 3,500-year-old stone slabs. On the other hand, a 1,500-year-old stone slab has also been found at Kaluttu Metupatti, 35 kilometers away from Madurai town. These again depict bulls. These again depict bulls being subdued by men. The historical references indicate that this sport was popular among the warriors during the Tamil classical period, though it was primarily meant for the farmers. Now, this sport obviously has parallels to the more globally famous Spanish bullfight, but there is one major difference. Unlike in the Spanish bullfight, the animals in Jallikattu are not harmed at all. Nowadays, the game has got transformed a bit. Jallikattu has changed a bit into becoming a game where the youth can prove their bravery and satisfy their sense of an adventure sport that has nothing to do with warriors or with men. In the present format, there are no coins placed on the bull's horn. Instead, Jallikattu is limited to subduing a running bull, but it still has the risk of falling under the bull's leg and injuring oneself while trying to subdue it. When the bull is released into the middle of the crowd, many young men try to control it with their hands and are seen holding the bull's hump lightly in trying to subdue it. There are no weapons, not even sticks used in this case. This is basically a sport for the farmers, and they try to. This is basically a sport for the farmers, and they train actually the bulls for this massively popular sport, where they're made to swim to gain strength, and also take many other precautions to make them strong and healthy. Jallikattu is a special occasion for the farmers in the sense that here they also get to showcase the strength of their native bulls. So these are played only with the native bulls. Later, when these bulls are not strong enough for the sport, they are used for agricultural purposes. In the modern times, the sport has also extended to some districts of Andhra Pradesh as well. Today, in the present time, that is, Jallikattu is organized with great zeal in Madurai and in the districts like Pudukottai, Tiruchirappalli, and Thanjavur. Now, I'll come to this aspect of how this ancient sport has or had become a marker of community identity. So as we have found that in modern times, Jallikattu, which had been prevalent only among a small number of people and only very few districts in southern Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, it suddenly acquired worldwide significance and became a marker of authentic Tamil identity since 2017. The massive protests of Tamil community rather, against the ban on Jallikattu attracted attention across the world. The making of this identity can be traced to two set of factors that are internal and external to the state of Tamil Nadu and the whole community of the Tamil. The external factors are rooted in contemporary political process, the central government's attitude towards the state of Tamil Nadu and the Tamil since 2014, its previous contentious role in the racial politics against Tamils in Sri Lanka, and its repeated attempts in imposing Hindi and Sanskrit at the cost of Tamil language in schools in Tamil Nadu. The internal factors can be traced to changing socio-economic realities, such as the agrarian crisis, increased anxieties among intermediate caste groups due to the recent new mobility of the Dalit group, and the rapid urbanization leading to a sense of nostalgia among those new to urban life. Now, a mass urbanization has led to changing social relations as well as to feelings of alienation and anxiety among recent Tamil migrants to cities because of the often ruthless and abstract nature of their new lifestyle. For a bit of background perspective, animal lovers have been waging a legal battle against Jallikattu since 2014 on the charge that it constituted cruelty to bulls. The elitist nature of such campaigns had been pointed out by many observers, and the pro-Jallikattu argument was that the force is not about taming the bulls, but rather about embracing them and expressing camaraderie with them. Taking its cue from the ancient Tamil literature, Jallikattu supporters argued that this sport is not a show of bravery or cruelty towards the animals, but is a practice of Yeru Azuvutal, or embracing the bull, as I've already mentioned. However, as the debate raged over a decade in courtrooms, newsrooms, and other public fora, the arguments of animal lovers under a variety of banners such as Animal Welfare Board of India and PETA had swayed over those who wanted to conserve their ancient culture. So we saw that two Pongal festivals in 2015 and 2016 went by without a Jallikattu event, much to the chagrin and the disappointment of the subaltern community. But in 2017, in January 2017, a group of Jallikattu supporters converged at a place called Alanganallur, a village near Madurai that is famous for the sport, demanding the lifting of the ban. Many of the protesters were students who expressed solidarity with the local people. When the police arrested the pro-Jallikattu protesters, this news spread like wildfire to social networking sites, resulting in, among other things, a group of Chennai students gathering at Marina Beach to demand the release of the arrested student protesters. The same day, people all over Tamil Nadu organized impromptu protests that were led by students and the youth. These protests subsequently came to be referred as the Tamil Spring and Thai Revolution. Thai has nothing to do with Thailand. This Thai is actually, this Thai refers to the Tamil month that is synonymous with hope and new opportunities brought on by the new harvest. So as I was saying, these protests acquired an iconic place in the history of Tamil Nadu for many reasons. Not only was it massive, non-violent and spontaneous, but men and women from all walks of life participated in the protests in large numbers. The protesters saw the ban on Jallikattu not only as an attack on the sport itself, but as an affront to Tamil culture and identity, even though many of the protesters had never watched a live session of the sport. They joined this protest simultaneously, and thus Jallikattu became a symbol of Tamil pride. Just to explain a little more, as the Tamil language was used by Dravidian politicians or even political parties to produce horizontal solidarities among the subaltern Tamils in the past, Jallikattu had, in 2017, that is, had become a symbol of Tamil pride in its political process that ensued. Although I'd say that the 2000 protests were seen as lawlessness by many in Delhi, Mumbai, and the other urban centers in India, and felt that the Tamils had been carried away by passion and pride instead of reason and nuance, they failed to see the reason, context, and histories that had led the Tamil people developing a deeper relationship with Jallikattu, with this Jallikattu sport. The most important factor is the Kaveri water dispute. That was one of the issues that echoed during this protest. As this dispute had influenced the politics of the state for a long time, due to the deep cultural and economic significance the river holds. The dispute has generated a sense of betrayal amongst the Tamils for long, as Karnataka, another state in India, had failed to implement the Supreme Court's directive to release the river water to save Samba rice crop in 2017 that is grown in Tamil Nadu. Despite rather the state government's efforts, the insufficient release of Kaveri water was seen as the main cause of the 2017 agrarian crisis, which took a heavy toll. More than 100 farmers committed suicide during this crisis. Now, interestingly, the National Human Rights Commission took suo motu cognizance of the death and ironically issued a notice to the Tamil Nadu government seeking an explanation for this death. Now, the people of the state started believing that the center had not only not done enough to ensure their share of Kaveri water, and that the farmers' deaths accentuated Tamil resentment against the center. This sense of injustice had remained fresh in the people's memories, which were evident from the slogans at the Jallikattu protest, pro-Jallikattu protest, that resonated throughout these. Enough is enough. In some places, Tamils perceived their state as being the victim of a larger conspiracy by the central government, where Kerala was being favored, the state of Kerala was being favored, and Tamil Nadu deceived. At some of the protests, the Sri Lankan Tamil issue was also raised, and the center was accused of collisions with the Sri Lankan in the massacre of Tamils in 2009. The central government's inaction on several other issues troubling the Tamil community also found resonance in the protests, and in that sense, Jallikattu became the trigger for the expression of a variety of issues and discontent. Jallikattu protest clearly indicates the failure of the attempt to subsume the Tamil identity under Hindu and other Indian identities, and even went to the extent of saying that if Jallikattu was not allowed, Tamil Nadu is the key. The omnipresent placards at the Jallikattu protest conveyed the message that PETA was a corporate lobby, and this ban on Jallikattu was a corporate ploy to play with the help of the Tamils. I will quote a housewife who was present at this protest, and she said, I quote, corporatization is happening rapidly. All things we use are controlled now by the corporate. What worries me most is that corporate things are occupying my kitchen. My children like junk food, noodles, soft drinks, like Coke and Pepsi, and so on. Now, the corporates have brought in substandard quality milk that would make my children weak. But the milk from the native cows would make them stronger. This is by Usha, who was a mother of two. Now, linking the ban on Jallikattu to the imagined corporate takeover of milk production in the state, the protesters managed to connect with that section of the Tamils who were never even interested in the sport. In various campaigns, the narrative that the bulls used in Jallikattu were native and purebred.
I think so. Just some might have some network issues. Anyways, to move on, Professor James, over to you.
Okay, can I start?
Yes, sir. Please.
Okay, can you put my slides up here?
Sorry, I got disconnected. Am I audible and visible now?
Yes, sir. That was one wonderful. We'll come back to you. Professor James would take over from here then.
Okay.
Shall I continue? Sorry, shall I continue?
Yes.
So we'll come back to you. Professor James was going to, because of your network issues.
Okay. If you can see
Oh,
my,
oh,
I have a short presentation in terms of my presentation in terms of community identity. I think there are several factors um, which hopefully you can see on the slide. First is geography, which presents a physical identity and location. There are cultural factors such as the arts, museums, and theaters that are associated with particular locations. Aesthetics such as architecture or parks in some cases. The economy is another one. Certain cities such as London, New York, Hong Kong are associated with economic hubs, international economic hubs. Religious would be another. Certainly Mecca would be associated with Islam, Rome or Vatican City with Catholicism. And sport itself can be either local, regional, or national. Okay, in terms of national identities, surely certain soccer clubs are associated with particular regions or particular countries or particular cities. If we think of rugby, we almost automatically think of South Africa or New Zealand. In terms of cricket, your own country, India or Pakistan, or people more familiar with the region might think of Kabaddi in both India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Certain other sports, such as Sepak Takraw, are endemic to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. And I think Afghanistan is probably the only one that continues to participate in Buzkazi. Something like dragon boat racing would be particular to China. Okay. We also see in sport a means of communal protest. You see, more recently, we have seen soccer protests in Egypt, Iran, Israel, and even more recently, in just the past few weeks, um, uh, sport protests, retaliatory protests against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, using sport as a form of punishment. Okay, particular to my country, in the United States, there are three major sports: baseball, American football, and basketball. All communities have teams in these particular sports. There are the club teams, park teams, and almost every school fields teams in these three sports, among many others. The school teams start very early, middle school, which would be ages starting around 11 or 12 years old, then high school students from 14 to 18 years old, and then the colleges and universities for young adults. The professional teams provide civic identity throughout the entire United States in these three sports, as well as identities to the towns that host colleges or universities. American football is the national sport of the United States today, and clearly it marks communal identity. The sport itself professes American values, particularly a martial spirit. Most people, even most Americans, don't realize how militaristic our culture is. Every single generation has fought in a war. Football stadiums themselves are built, many of them, as war memorials. There's a close tie between football and military leadership. Many of the Navy admirals and Army generals have been football players. I don't have time or space to provide the terminology of football for you, but it is very violent and warlike. The strategy of the game is very much that of war. The mascots of the teams are very aggressive, usually aggressive animals or the other aggressive types such as warriors. And all of the games, or many of the major games, are performed in conjunction with nationalistic rituals, such as you can see the photo here of the flyover of the military jets. But sport is a communal festival. The fans are participants in the sport, not as players, but they are cheerleaders, usually young women dressed in short costumes, who promote the cheering of fans. I don't know if you know the term tailgating, but tailgating is particular to American football, where people in their cars bring large amounts of food and alcohol and have parties in parking lots before and after the games. There are alumni parties, especially at the colleges and universities, for people who have graduated from the colleges to try to ensure an ongoing loyalty to the school, and with the hope that they will provide money donations to the school throughout their lives. For those who are not college graduates, and this is most people in America, they congregate in sports bars all throughout all of the cities to cheer on their particular teams. And particular bars are associated with loyalty to particular teams. The most recent fad, no longer a fad, relative to sports, is internet gambling that more and more people, especially young men, are involved in as a community in itself. Football, American football, becomes a national festival in the fall after football season is over, as the professional teams battle in the championship game known as the Super Bowl. Right? It consists of huge parties that people throw. It goes on media attention over 2 weeks, highlighting the teams themselves, particular players, the coaches. Right? But people throw huge parties just to watch this game. A commercial for this past year, a 30-second commercial, cost $7.5 million on the television. So my last slide here, it's particularly in the United States, where people have become more secular and less religious. Sport has filled that vacuum as sort of a secular religion. It has its own rituals, its own ceremonies, high priests in the form of the league commissioners or the officials. It has sacred sites such as halls of fame. And these are basically shrines to the heroes of the game. Fans perform pilgrimages just like they would to religious sites. They travel to these halls of fame to view these relics of these stars, where the idols and the saints and the martyrs are all portrayed in the Hall of Fame. And they have devout followers, maybe you can see the photos here, who dress up in particular costumes or in particular manners to express their exuberance and their feeling for the team and their loyalties. Okay, that's my last slide. I will stop there to allow for time for discussion.
Right. That was wonderful, sir. Thank you very much. Moving on to Professor Whitinui. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute.
Just wondering if I could share my screen. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
If that's all right.
Yes, sir, sure.
Slides. I'm not sure. Do they have to be loaded?
No, sir, you click on the share option at the bottom of your screen.
Oh, your
and then you
computer.
select the tabs, select tabs option.
Okay. Just 1 second. Should have been able to do that earlier. Apologise. See if it's going to open. Processing. I'm just having a few internet connections here, and it's very hard to hear people. So I've been trying to fix the crackling noise in the background, but I can't do it. So here's I just see my slides have come up here. I guess I just click that. How's that?
There we go. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody.
I have no experience whatsoever in there. So I see how it works now. So, okay. So yes, so thanks for the opportunity. I know I have very brief time to share some thoughts and ideas, experiences around the notion of establishing community identity. It's for me, in terms of my connection to this particular forum, and also my connection to Indigenous peoples around the world, it's important for me to acknowledge where I'm calling in from. I'm actually on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking families, Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanich peoples. who've been part of this land since time immemorial, way before colonisation. The University of Victoria, where I'm calling in from, actually resides on the Songhees land. And we have ongoing relationships, unwavering relationships with the First Nations peoples here on the lands where I'm connected. I also want to acknowledge the first peoples of India, particularly the peoples that I've had the closest association with, the Dalits, and people particularly in Manchegam, Kastanaraj, who have spent a lot of time in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and we got to learn a lot about the politics that exist in India and how incredibly complex it is. So I want to also acknowledge the ongoing struggles that exist in India, and also understand that our connections, particularly around the world in terms of Indigenous peoples, are very closely aligned to the struggles of colonisation. I also want to acknowledge the school that I'm in, the School of Exercise Science, Physical Health Education here at the University of Victoria, where I've been now for 6 years. I have enjoyed actually challenging many of the very, what we call clinical perspectives around sport. We have a very strong science-based fraternity here. And so as a sociologist and interdisciplinary educator, I have the opportunity to share ideas, particularly around my scholarship, which is really fundamentally based in community engaged scholarship. So just on that note, it's important for me also to acknowledge where I'm from, and also in terms of the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I've spent most of my life and most of my experiences come from Aotearoa. I spent 20 years in the terms of the Waikato Tainui people, where they actually have a king. His name is Kingi Tuheitia. And one of his whakataukis, which is a Māori proverb or saying in terms of helping to build the community, goes pretty much like amohia ake te aora te iwi kia puta ki te whāau, which means the well-being of you, our community, is important to us. So that to me prefaces the idea that we don't do things in isolation. We don't profess to say that as a nation, this is what we do, because this is what's happened as a result of colonization. We actually look at the ideas around who we are as a people, and we determine what is best for us. And so in that respect, it was really hard to answer the question establishing community identity through sports. So I had to reframe the questions slightly. These are some of my experiences of playing sport. I've played sport all my life, like most of us, I'm sure, have been engaged in sport at some time. And my three boys now are also equally involved in sport, in rugby league, basketball, soccer, and the youngest one now is turning his attention to volleyball, even though they've had experiences in a range of sports. Both my sons live in Hawaii, and I have another son that lives in Australia. So it is, we actually, this is the whole idea of community. We are diverse in terms of our communities. And also my experience is what it was like in a very small urban town. Things have significantly expanded in terms of our community outreach to what sport and identity means to us. So it's important to also understand too, there's a dearth of information. There's tons of anecdotes around what we believe is actually happening in terms of our experiences in playing sports as Indigenous peoples, but no real hard evidence to suggest that this is the right way or this should be the way we should progress. Every community have their own aspirations and their own needs for what is needed for them in terms of their sport. And what I mean by that is that the idea of being active is always been a part of our DNA. It's not something that just came about because of sport. The idea of playing sport is a kind of a relatively new notion for us, because most of the way that we interpreted sports was that it was just a pastime, leisure time, or it helped to support the collective well-being of the tribe and fostered our ability to thrive and succeed and survive. We would never have navigated the oceans as well as we did without having this as part of our everyday life. So it's important to understand that the idea of establishing community and through sports, it doesn't quite work that way for us. And in particular, it's really important to ask two fundamental questions. How do iwi Māori, in my sense, in terms of Indigenous peoples, define community as iwi Māori? Not what a nation defines us as. I think it's an important question to ask in terms of establishing identity as a community. And we have many, many layers of community, which I will share with you in terms of how we look at what a community is. Some people would actually would ask the question, now, who is your community? Because we have so many different arrays of what people perceive it. And if we want to maintain our identity, we have to really go back to where it all started so that we can reclaim our identity and establish our identity in the way that we would have anticipated it to be prior to colonization. And so we have many ways of doing that. And then our second question is, what is our Indigenous relationship, or what is, in our case, iwi Māori's relationship to or with sports that helps to establish community identity as Māori is the key word? Okay, so these are two quite big questions, and it may not be that we get through all of that today in the 6 or 7 minutes I have left. But it's important to ask those questions as a preface to this discussion. And it may also be interesting for others who are in the same situation to ask those questions as well. And basically where we were coming from is a culturally reasoned approach. So Sir Professor Mason Drury, one of our leading health researchers and leading educators in terms of Indigenous Māori views around health and wellness of community, has always said, you don't say, how do I adapt sport, health, or education to Indigenous peoples. Rather, you start from the premise, what is important to Indigenous peoples or iwi Māori in terms of our language, culture, identities, and ways of knowing, and you build around it. We don't allow sport to infiltrate or recolonize us in the same ways that colonization has done to us for many years. So we're reframing in many ways what sport actually means for us, and we're adapting that mechanism so that it actually helps to elevate education, health, language, culture, you name it, our history as well. So it's a very different approach to what we are normally told is happening at that level. We also know that it builds our collective mana. It builds mana as our essence, our who we are as a person. We're all born with it. We're all born with mana because we come from a generation of many ancestors who allow us to be here and who allow us to actually continue to thrive and prosper. We're not just here on our own. So sport not only builds community, it also builds the collective mana of the tribe, because everyone who achieves local, provincial, national, international playing through their personal achievements, through good works and ability, lifts the whole mana of the tribe, the whole mana of the group, the whole mana of the community. All right? And I could talk about many examples of people who have gone on and been Olympic champions from very small, humble beginnings because they believe in this philosophy. And it's not just this idea for the nation state. It's not driven by a national or ritualistic or anything. It's all about community. It is the essence of who we are. We also understand metaphorically and very simplistically that we as a person exist and therefore we have mana. We are also protected by our immediate family, by our relations, and by also the tribe and the larger affiliates that come with those. And I will expand just briefly on what Whānau actually means in the next slide. But in the actual diagram on the side, which is actually informs our education system as well. We believe that children who come to school don't just come on their own. They have parents, they have relations, they have stories, they have prior experiences that build their essence within a community. And so, as a family situation, in a family environment, we're able to establish what we call this care, all under the purposes of mana. And so mana can be enhanced or it can be diminished based on your family, based on your community, based on your connections, based on your language, your culture, your identity in that community. So therefore, the reason why we have so many social disparities or disconnects or gaps, as people like to call them, is because we need to rekindle the community so that we can establish our identity as it was meant to be. And so we have worked really hard in many of our communities at home in New Zealand to do that. Likewise, with the communities that we're here in Canada are doing very similarly. So it's important to understand that kind of conceptual framework. We also have 6 cultural anchors of establishing community identity. I can't go into all of them in much detail, other than to say that the whenua, which is the land and the water, we are the land and the water are us. We are intimately connected. That's a really significant part of our community identity. Whānau, as I just shared before, is based on a range of connections, relational connections. And our kinship, our genealogies, they present to us our potential. And then we have inheritance. We're actually inherited these gifts. They don't just come from books. They don't just come from outer space. So they might do, though. But they're actually transcended through time over many, many generations that align with the first 3. And then with the mana and Māori is our ability to be. We can diminish our mana or we can enhance it based on our relationship to the first 4. And Māori is our life force, because if we are actually adhering to our cultural identity and our language, our practices and our philosophies, we will be well. And when we're well, our whole tribe's well. That's how it works. And that's how we establish community identity, even in sports. It's not just a show, it's a lot of entertainment, it's a lot of pleasure and joy we get from it, but it is actually all about our community. All right? So it's really important. And Whānau is very diverse. And sometimes we spend a lot of time investigating or exploring those diversities. But we also need to remember where they're actually located and where they're centralized in terms of our own identity and our own kinship structures. And bringing those back to bear in terms of understanding where people are at is more the point, I believe, in terms of sometimes it's about re-establishing identity and connection back to community. And so we spend a lot of time in our tribal entities and our tribal communities spend a lot of time doing exactly that, because we know that we are diverse. We have many different kinds of whānau who exist all over the world, as well as nationally and locally, and urban as well as rural. So it's important that we understand where they're at and connect them back to our to who they are. And so we have ways of doing that within our own communities. So, of course, and just to sort of finish here, I mean, we've had a long affiliation with sports, but more importantly, games and pastimes prior, during, post-colonisation. We often refer to them that way as whare tapere or whare rehea, the arts of pleasure, amusement, and entertainment, because they allow us to be playful, to be joyous, carefree. They provide the outdoor life that enhances our ability to be well. There's a collective responsibility to the day-to-day activities, and we have large gatherings where we are often sharing different kinds of talents and skills within those particular areas. That book by Alison Bess, Games and Pastimes of the Māori People, just as there would be in many other different cultures, are really important It's not just about the games, it's about the philosophies and the rationales as to why those games were played. And many of them relate back to our creation stories. And those creation stories are then kept alive through those games. And that's how community identity is fostered in relationship to who we are as a people. I've conceptualized it over the years in terms of enabling. It's not so much about establishing community for it, it's about reclaiming and enabling us to have that culture and creative potential reliven and reignited for our communities. So it's all built on a culture of relationships, respect, responsibility, and care. And it is our duty really to continue to foster that over time. I could talk individually about each one of the aspects within the conceptual framework, but I think I'll leave it there because I'm really conscious of time and people might have questions. So. And the last one here is basically comes back to, which aligns to what Kingi Tuheitia was saying, is that tahara takutoa I te toa takatahi, engari he toa takatini, which is my strength is not that of an individual, but that of the collective. And so it's important that we might need to reframe many of the different proposed themes and questions that are asked to us, particularly from a Western or Eurocentric perspective. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Right, that was wonderful, sir. Thank you. Coming back to Professor Banerjee, you were cut short earlier. If you'd like to continue, apologies for that. So
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, so I think I have made my points pretty clear. Just a few concluding sentences. So, what I was trying to say is that in these various pro-Jallikattu campaigns, the narrative that was used was that the bulls used in Jallikattu were pure native bred and they were preserved because of Jallikattu. Okay, and it was also believed that the sport helped in segregating the best bulls from the weak ones, and that these winning bulls were then bred with cows, which went to offer the best food. The cows were expected to live longer and offer enough milk for both their calves and the people. These purebred bulls were known as Tangayam and Pulikulam and were preserved primarily for breeding and took part in Jallikattu. So people believed that if the sport was banned, that they would lose this native breed of cattle. This sentiment resonated throughout the protest. So the fear that was there was the fear that was there was that the banning of Jallikattu would ultimately result in the vanishing of the native species and ultimately result in the country turning into import dependent on bovine energy. The fear that generated particularly among the women and the rural community dwellers was that losing such cattle would mean losing self-sufficiency in milk production. So the campaign was conducted so vehemently that it bordered on neo-nativism. So I can say that we note that even though the sport Jallikattu was practiced by only a section of the Tamil populace, the sentiment and the mobilization for Jallikattu was driven by an active social media presence which became possible because of an educated class that had formed across caste groups and an overall Tamil cultural public. So my last concluding sentence would be the groundswell of student and youth activism was seen as a Tamil spring akin to the Arab Spring. It is indeed a spring in terms of its mobilization, if not in content. And just as the self-immolation of a young street vendor in Tunisia triggered a sea of protests that became the Arab Spring, so Jallikattu became a trigger for the Tamil Spring. Jallikattu has now become a classic and living example of a sport that defined and reunited a community and justified Edward Tyler's proposition, which I began, that our subcultures become part of our identities, which may or may not go away with time. So I leave it at that. I'm sure you'll be having many questions to ask to the three of us, and so I'll not take more time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
all right. Moving on to the Q&As then. My first question is for Professor James. So, in an often divided world, sport is a unique and important connective tissue that binds people together, both across and within societies. But can the same sports draw a line as well? How does the difference that exists within social groups in terms of the perceived values they possess concerning their social impacts result in the engagement of sport and culture? And is there a disappropriate social impact of this engagement on different groups or communities?
Yes, in terms of the first part of the question, do sports draw a line? Yes, I think in many ways, especially in the past, they did. Uh, Especially in American culture, race has and continues to be a particular characteristic of American culture which divides us. So in the past, especially African American athletes were not allowed to play with white athletes until in 1947, baseball, the national game, introduced the first black athlete. It was so successful that it opened doors for other black athletes. This was even a decade before the federal government passed laws to this effect. In that respect, again, more recently, in American football, the leader, or the man who generated the Black Lives Matter movement, which has become international, as you know, now, was an American black American football player. Was derided by President Trump for that. The other area that is still a contested environment is transgender athletes. Today, there's an ongoing discussion about whether or not transgender athletes should be allowed to participate. Some states have enacted laws denying them that opportunity, others have not. Just about a week ago, a transgender athlete won the national swimming championships. And that's come under much discussion lately. So where sport does draw us together, it also can pull us apart in some ways. And so there is a disproportionate social impact on different groups and communities. And that in the past, it has been not only race, but also religious and ethnic groups. So in terms of unifying the community at large, the national community, their breakthroughs in sport have enabled them to gain greater attention, greater recognition, greater respect, which has tended to diminish the ethnic and religious and racial stereotypes of the past.
Right. My next question is for Professor Whitinui. So, the contributions of indigenous people to Canadian sport are visible today in sports such as canoeing and snowshoeing. Do you think that such sports often preserve the heritage of a community better while blending the modern and the traditional? And is this why sports play such an integral part in multicultural societies? Sir, you're on mute.
Sorry, there's about 3 layers to that question. Sorry, I didn't hear the first part about the sports you identified.
So, canoeing and snowshoeing.
What was the first one, sorry?
Kayaking,
Oh,
canoeing, and
kayaking.
snowshoeing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gerald. First of all, the sports, they're not considered sports. Some of the sports that they say they're sports, they're actually part of our way of life. Canoeing, kayaking is part of our life, or part of our ways of connecting with the water. And we took great pride and time to make sure that we created the appropriate equipment or appropriate tools to be able to navigate the land. So much, in fact, that many of the cultures today have actually replicated many of our ideas. I'm talking specifically about the America's Cup. Some of the designs of the double hull canoes were we advanced those well before they did. They realized that they could make double hull canoes, and that they could, in a particular way, that could move across the water just as quickly, with modern technology, of course. But their design is very much the same as what we use to sail around the world well before colonization. And it was also indicated too in terms of some of the big ships, the colonial ships that they were basically dead in the water. We used to pass them seamlessly in the water, and they were still standing. So there's lots of stories like that. But the other part of the question is that can sports, or the notion of sports, blend the two worldviews? Of course they can. Indigenous peoples are actually very curious people. We've spent great amount of time engaging with different knowledge systems for a long, long time. The issue is really about, will other cultures accept indigenous ways of knowing in the same way that we've afforded the same respect for their ways of knowing? That's the question. And we still in 2021 are having those debates right in the institution that I'm in. So we have still a long way to go in terms of accepting our ways of knowing, as you suggest, as a multicultural society, which is normally based on neoliberal agenda, which was never our intention. Our knowledge is not about making money, exploiting us for money. It's about sharing knowledge, and that's what we continue to do. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question entirely, but I think it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Right. My next question is for Professor Banerjee. So sports, as many commentators have noted, is the new religion. And you've spoken about Tamil community specifically, but in a country like India with multiple religious groups and communities, do you actually agree that sports can efficiently play the role of one big secular religion?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. I only hope that I'll be able to answer it properly. See, India is a very vast country, topographically, ethnographically, culturally. So it's very interesting that I, as a Bengali, relate more to people from Bangladesh than to a Tamilian or a person from Kashmir. But nothing unites Indians more than sports. Just imagine what happens when India is playing against Pakistan in a cricket match. Cricket unites India. Cricket with our arch rivals unite India. So, sports is definitely one of those things that unite even multicultural countries. It is a secular religion. You ask any person from any state of India, be he from Kashmir, be he from Madhya Pradesh, who is cricket god, and they will all say Sachin Tendulkar. Okay, not only in India, I'll tell you, we in India, all people in England, all people in Australia, everywhere, you will have these fans of, say, Ronaldo. So that is a community. Fans of Messi fan club, that is a community. Or we might say fans of Barcelona, fans of Real Madrid. So these are communities, just like a Facebook community. So we have 14 communities, and these actually cut across borders. And they not only unite people from a single country, but they have the potential of uniting people from many countries and many continents. So definitely, sports is a secular religion. I agree with that. I hope I will be able to answer your question satisfactorily.
Yes, sir, you have. Moving on, my next question is for Professor James. So, as a symbol of American creed, playing a sport can allow people to do what they like the most and express their specific interests. How do you think certain sports craft the American identity better than the others?
As I tried to tell you briefly in my presentation, there are two sports in particular. Baseball was considered the national sport, and it was considered to be the one that portrayed American values because the way the game is played, maybe cricket is similar, on defense, it portrayed a democracy because all team members had to contribute to the good of the team if they were going to prosper or they were going to win the game. Whereas when they batted, in cricket, I guess they would be, batsmen as well. It was based on individualism, how well one performed individually, and they were paid better accordingly. Okay, so this demonstrated the basic cultural values of American society at the time. But since the 1960s, American football has superseded baseball as the national sport. And as I explained a little bit about football, if people, even if you don't know much about the game, just to watch it, it's a very violent game. In many ways, it replicates the American society. Guns are very prevalent in the United States still. The Western frontier was built on violence. As I said, all American generations have fought in the war. The language of the game is very violent, as is the strategy. And so I think football very much personifies American culture in the current era.
Right. My next question is for Professor Whitinui. So, whether a modern sport is a microcosm of modern society, that is what it is called often, how do you think that sports highlight the persistent problems of the modern society and culture? Uh, so, you're on mute again.
So it's quite hard to hear. Can you just say that last part of that question again?
How do you think that sports highlight the persistent problems of the modern society and culture?
Right. Well, I think if you look at it from an Indigenous perspective, and having lived here now in Canada and New Zealand, and having attended a number of Indigenous specific conferences over the years, the idea that sports is a vehicle to help us to be healthier, as a vehicle to promote our language, our culture, our identity. I think it has a significant impact on the way that a society in of itself sees itself. And what I'm referring to here too is that as my colleagues online in the talk have spoken around, it has these certain values, and it brings a level of unity to bear on groups, because it's seen as a place where we can, and in particular in before colonization, it was a way of resolving conflict. And the idea of resolving conflict through sport was often a way to restore balance to a tribe, or restore balance or healing. It was also a way to understand different points of view. And so I'm not a fan of the word microcosm, but I understand what it means from an ecological perspective. But I prefer, if we look at a community from a more organic, holistic perspective, and also from a kinship model in terms of relationships, it enhances our values as a people, and it enhances our humanity. It enhances what it means to be human. And I think, with all the values and all the intentions of bringing people together and connecting, I think that's what it means for us as Indigenous peoples, and it affords the opportunity to enhance what it means, those values and humanity. That makes sense.
Right. My last question is for Professor Banerjee. So, sports and politics should not mix. That's what people often say, but it often does mixes in the end. Do you think that the political insights in sports as a concept and the athletes associated with it, along with the media sports culture, often takes away the very role that sports should play in building a community culture? Therefore, in retrospect, do you think that media politics and journalism become a powerful motivator and a driving force for manipulating sports and crafting cultural identity through it?
Wow, that's a very layered question. I don't even think I'll be able to answer it properly. But and I also assume that when you're saying politics, you are meaning it with a negative connotation, because politics can be broken up into two words: poly, many, and six, blood-sucking animals. So I'm not even sure what you mean by politics. But I'm assuming that by politics you mean something not healthy, something not good, something that is into the values of the essence of sports, such as camaraderie. So no, politics does not always necessarily get into sports for negative reasons. Sometimes it can be very positive. As Paul was saying just a moment earlier, we have this cricket diplomacy between India and Australia. So when the relationship between India and Australia was very cold, and we were looking for uranium and the things were not working, so we had this cricket diplomacy. So if you think of that as politics, sending the Indian cricket team to play against Australia because it garnered a lot of views, it generated a lot of money, a lot of interest, and through that he could saw the the diplomatic relations of that country. It is not bad. Politics is not actually taking away from the sport. But when you mean about the things like politicians getting involved in sports and sports person promoting a particular brand of politics or politician, then that obviously takes away from the essence of sports, which is very different from promotion of a particular kind of ideology. It shouldn't be, but sadly there is. So I leave it at that. I'll not drag this answer, but they are not mutually exclusive because remember, sports as a culture. I mean, if I talk of the high culture and the low culture, that cultural nationalism is a term which literary critics and historians use to refer to certain modern communities that practices by modern communities that are sometimes unsanctioned by and sometimes undercut state authority, and these include both the high culture and the low culture. So if I take sports as a high culture, I'll take politics as a low culture. So that will be my answer.
Right. Thank you, sir. With that, we come to an end. It was an absolute delight to get to know such exciting and thought-provoking insights about sports and its relation to communities, culture, traditions, and society. I'm sure our viewers who watch the live and who will be watching it on Facebook would love the session equally. Thank you once again to Professor James, Professor Whitinui, and Professor Banerjee for taking out time from your busy schedules to speak on the TMYS platform. It was absolutely enriching. Just a reminder, we are calling for submissions of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure.
Okay.